So I have this period, really, in a way, 1766 to 1865. I'm going to talk a little bit about. And by the way, what we talk about here is not just things like history books in school that you might have where they talk about, the Revolution and the Civil War and things like that. We're also talking about people, because people built this building. People were inspired by their faith to want this kind of facility. And so we want to talk about some of the people. Some of them are buried out behind this church. And to us today, they're just a tombstone. But obviously when they lived, they had their hopes, dreams, families, careers right here in this area. And we want to give a little bit of a flavor to you of who are those people, because we're the people in this room who are here today that can make a difference. If all of us are silent, this building won't take care of itself. So we have a commitment to try to give a little bit of that. Teresa Parrish's report goes into a deep dive into lots of people, lots of every minister. If you want to know more, we're not going to get into all of that because it's too much detail for this, but if you want to know more, it's in there. So anyway, I wanted to talk about the start of Methodism here in Virginia. So I draw your attention to this, 1766. That was 10 years before the United States became independent, so it's a long time ago. And in 1766, a Reverend Strawbridge crossed the Potomac River from where he lived. He lived up near Frederick, Maryland. And he came into Northern Virginia with being the first Methodist. He actually wasn't a minister yet at that point, but he was an evangelist for Methodism. Methodism had just started in England around that same time. And so it was new to the United States. It wasn't even the United States, so it was the colonies still then. And he came across the river, which was this area very sparsely populated. And he went to Leesburg. And in Leesburg, he founded this log cabin church. Now, this is a reconstruction. The church was demolished 100 years ago, but it was been rebuilt recently. And this is what it looked like. It was a log cabin. And I was particularly drawn to the sanctuary. Could you have a plainer sanctuary than that? Could you have a simpler? We think this church is simple, but this is a cathedral compared with that church, and there's the lectern in front. And so he brought Methodism here to Northern Virginia. And by the way, at about this time, the population of Fairfax County, which I believe then also included Loudoun County, was about 4,000 people. And most of those people lived in Alexandria, a long way from here. So it's just an indication of how few people lived up in this corner of the country. And obviously having churches built all around wouldn't make sense, because there might be one person here and one person 10 miles over there. So this was a big deal that he built this facility, had this facility built in Leesburg. And the way that people used to get around, I put over on the picture side there, there's one man on a horse. That's how people got around. It's obvious that there were no bridges between here. I'm not sure how he got across the Potomac River, but people traveled, ministers on the circuit for many years, just like that picture over on the left. One person all by themselves going from place to place, giving the word of the Lord and a sermon. And here's the marker in Leesburg where you can go today. You can see the old stone church site. And here's what's interesting. The first property in America deeded for a Methodist church, May 1766, official national shrine of the United Methodist Church. So there's a facility in Leesburg, and that's how Methodism started to come to this area. We are a Methodist church, but our history evolved from this very important basis. I also want to just add that Reverend Strawbridge died at a young age, about 49 years old. It was even before the Methodist Episcopal Church was officially launched as a denomination here. And he was replaced by Francis Asbury, who, if you know much about Methodism, was a huge name because he became the evangelist for much of the eastern United States. And he rode the circuit. And I read in my research that he delivered in his lifetime as much as 16,000 sermons, and he traveled over 250,000 miles. So he rode the circuit where people lived over and over and over again and went broadly around this area. So this foundation in Northern Virginia of Methodism was carried on after Reverend Strawbridge's untimely death. So people started to move into this area, and over time, there were more people. So in 1830, the Liberty Meeting House was built, and the Liberty Meeting House was built. Do you all know where the Drainesville Methodist Church is? Up on the big hill? It was built there. And this is actually a later addition. The first one, I believe, was a log cabin there as well. And that brought a church closer to where we live today. People didn't have to go all the way to Leesburg then. They could go to Drainesville. And so in 1830, that church was built. It had no denomination. So any religious group could use the Liberty Meeting House. And so on a Sunday, there might be a Methodist service in the morning, followed by late morning with the Baptists, and so on throughout the day. They all could use it. It was basically a community center where religion was could be practiced at any time during the week. And people would travel long distances, and I mentioned before, sometimes services would last for several hours because people did travel a long distance, and they wanted to feel it was worth their while. So Pastor, perhaps you'd like to start offering longer services here for us if we want to live up to that. Also in this time period, 1830s, Twyla mentioned the Bixlers. The Bixlers owned property over here somewhere along Seneca Road. And an interesting side, like he was became a trustee of this church later, by the way. But his sons owned property adjacent to his. And in 1839, he told his sons to build a 30-foot wide road between his farm and their farm. That's how Seneca Road got started. So there's one man saying, well, gee, and again, there's probably what, 2 or 3 or 4 farms around here? And anyway, that's an interesting sidelight of how our nearby road got started. In 1844, moving ahead a few years, slavery came to dominate not only the Methodists, but all the other religions. But in Methodist, the northern delegates at the Methodist conference passed a resolution saying that the bishop could not perform his duties anymore until slavery was ended. And the passage of that resolution split the Methodist Church, because after the passage of that, the Southern Methodists created the Methodist Episcopal Church South, as they called it. They basically withdrew from the regular Methodist Church. So pause for a minute and think, what's happening in our time? They didn't call it the Global Methodist Church. In fact, the main church in the north, and in particular here for the time being, was still called the Methodist Episcopal Church. But the southern group was called Methodist Episcopal Church South. So the issue of slavery split the church and was a significant factor, of course, in how the two religions went different ways for many decades. So that was in 1844. And by the way, the impact of that on the Liberty Meeting House was that the Methodists in this area would not worship at the same time. The parish history goes into that. They wouldn't even talk to each other. So you had neighbors who went to the Southern church and the Northern church, and they would have separate services, and they wouldn't even talk to each other. I wanted to move along here, and the next major thing I want to move ahead to was 1852, when the Jefferson Schoolhouse was built. The Jefferson Schoolhouse was about a mile east of here, and it was here until about a year and a half ago when it was demolished for a house. You can still tell where the site is, though, because 3 of the biggest white oak trees in Great Falls are still in the front yard, and they were very careful about preserving those. So this is our current picture. It didn't look like that in 1852, but the 1852 building is incorporated into that structure, which later became a residence. And the Jefferson Schoolhouse was key to us because it was built in 1852. It was a school, weekday school for children in this area. There was no government school system. So the farmers said, we need to teach our young people. They put the money in, they built it, they operated it. And in 1857, there started to be Sunday school meetings at that school, which they called them Sunday school meetings, but they're held on Saturdays. But anyway, they started to have Sunday school meetings. And that's where many of the residents here who went to the Liberty Meeting House would go there with their kids and the adults for the Sunday school programs on Saturdays. So this started to take on a form almost of a church back in 1857. Over here, I just put for all you young folks, here's a report card from actually 1906, so much later, but I found that in the archives, and it's someone's, Ruth Jenkins, report card for February 1906 on how she did on reading, spelling, arithmetic, geography, grammar, and history. Number of days present, she didn't miss any, and her deportment was good. So I thought that was an interesting sideline. Now, I'm going to wrap up here in a minute. I wanted to mention, so that was in 1852. In 1854, 2 people moved here, Jesse and Lucina Smith. And there's a photograph of Jesse Smith, his birth and death dates, and his wife Lucina with a family portrait, which I mentioned earlier, Tom McQueen. That's the McQueens own that portrait of Lucina, and there's a very beautiful picture of her. They moved here from upstate New York, near Rochester, actually. And Jesse had been born in Wales and emigrated here when he was 18 years old. He was a carpenter by trade and supposedly also built several churches up in northern New York when he lived up there. In 1844, he and Lucina were married. Lucina was a native of that area. They decided to move down to Northern Virginia. And I'd love to know why they moved here, because if you know where Rochester, New York is, that's pretty far north. By horse and buggy, they had to travel through beautiful farmland in New York State, through beautiful farmland all through Pennsylvania, through Western Maryland to get to Northern Virginia. Why would they ever, if you're looking for a new farm, pass by all those other places? Pardon me? The snow. The snow, it could have been, it might have been snow. Or when I think about it, could it be the ministers, the circuit ministers? Remember, Strawbridge had come down here and crossed the river and put this area on the map. And it was followed by Francis Asbury. And I'm sure as Methodists, they had heard something about Northern Virginia. Because why would they come to this? I mean, why did they go here? Why didn't they just keep going to South Carolina or something? And I'm just wondering if their faith wasn't one reason that drew them to this area, having heard about Leesburg and the church there, that they wanted to come to some place that was served by the Methodist Church. Well, that's just speculation. But I wanted to mention that after they started doing the Sunday school at Jefferson School, Lucina was one of the Sunday school teachers there. And their daughter, Emily, is reported to have the Sunday school program, by the way, listen to this, all you young people, was to memorize biblical verses. And Emily supposedly had memorized 100 verses from the Bible and can recite them by memory in front of the congregation. So how would you like to start that program here? Let's see, I think that's the final thing I would just mention, I don't have a slide for it, is 1857, the Civil War started in 1860. And this area was crisscrossed by many different, both Union and Confederate troops. There was a battle at Drainsville, just down here at Seneca Road and Georgetown Pike in December 1861, where 57 men from both sides were killed. And the Church of the Brethren commemorates that every year, by the way, because the battlefield is where their church is built. It was part of the battlefield. Teresa Parrish's report goes into what was it like to live in this area at that time because of the crisscrossing of all the troops. And the troops would come through and they would steal their cows, their chickens, tear down their fences and use them for lumber, fires. And it was it impoverished this area during the 5 years that the Civil War went on. And next week we'll talk more about it, but the Smiths lived right up the road here. And inevitably they saw some of that, and having come from the north and having been part of the Methodist Church Episcopal, not the United Methodist Church Episcopal South, they were no doubt targets by the Confederates, who viewed them as an enemy. And imagine what it was like to live here in those days. Just one final thing before I turn it over to Twyla, is that in 1863, Jeb Stuart took 5,000 Confederate troops, including wagons and horses, up Seneca Road to cross the Potomac right at the end of Seneca Road on his way to Gettysburg. So imagine 5,000 men and wagons going up a narrow dirt road past this church. That's an indication of what the Civil War was like and how it was so damaging to this area. This was one of the few places they could cross, and they had to cross at night during a flood, by the way, by moonlight. Well, anyway, that goes into too much detail. But anyway, I think that's my last slide. So I'm turning it over to Twyla. Thank you.